So official welcome to the Bournemouth University Masterclass. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Andy. I'm from the Bournemouth University International team. Joining us today, speaking to us today is Deborah Taylor, a senior lecturer from our business school and the director of the Bournemouth MBA, who's going to be talking to us about emotional intelligence and leadership and why it's important. I think I'll hand straight over to you, Deborah, if that's all right. We've got a good turnout here, so I think we'll set you going. You're still on mute, by the way. If
Rookie error. So thank you very much, Andy, and welcome everybody. Thank you for coming along today. I wasn't really sure of numbers given it's sunny, or certainly sunny in Bournemouth, and the first tentative steps out of lockdown, so it's really lovely that you came along. Thank you. So this is an example of an MBA class. So I've tried to make it similar to that, although usually it would be for a longer period, so we would have more time for discussion. But before I start, what would be really helpful is if in the chat you could just put a couple of words of why you're here, please. Is it because you're interested in the topic? Are you interested in undertaking an MBA? Are you interested in professional development generally? Just a couple of people adding some thoughts would be really helpful. And then what I can do is try and tailor the session in terms of what everybody's interested in. Okay, so topic, considering an MBA, research leadership, improving EI. Hello Gordon, nice to see you. To be a best person, very honourable, thank you. Interesting topic, so lots of people interested in the topic and professional development. Excellent, thank you for that. What I'll do now is I'll share my slides and I will try as much as possible to give everybody something that you want and will find useful. So as I've mentioned, today I'm going to talk about emotional intelligence and leadership. We're going to look at the key components of one emotional intelligence concept. Now, there are lots of people who research emotional intelligence, and so it's a really popular topic, as you can imagine. So we're going to look today at a conception by Daniel Goleman, who probably popularised emotional intelligence and also talks a lot about leadership. So he's really an expert in this area. We're also going to look at the links to leadership, and I'm going to give you some practical thoughts on that rather than theoretical thoughts. And then I'm going to get you working on some exercises. Now, apologies if I keep looking up. My screen is above the camera, and so it looks as though I'm looking up a lot. But what is emotional intelligence? Well, as I've said, it's multifaceted and there are lots of different perspectives. So I've just provided two here. And the one on the left is a focus really on ability. And so it's really the interplay between our emotions and our cognitive abilities. Whereas the one on the right is what's known as a mixed EI model. And so this is far broader than classifying EI as an intelligence, but really looks at it as a compound conception, including mental abilities, dispositions, and traits. And Daniel Goleman, whose work I'm going to base this session on, is somebody who uses a mixed EI model. And he really, as I mentioned, was the first person to popularise emotional intelligence. And he looked at 188 companies across the globe to see what it was that their effective leaders did, which was different to everybody else. And so he felt that it came down to 3 different levels. So there's the technical skills, so things like your business planning or your technical expertise. Then there's the cognitive skills, so things like critical thinking. And then finally, there's the emotional skills. And these emotional skills, his research discovered, were twice as important for effective leaders than technical and cognitive skills. And actually, the further up the hierarchy you go in an organisation, the more important these emotional skills become. So he believes they're really important. So the model we're going to look at has 4 different elements to it. And Goldman has had a number of different conceptualizations, and this is one from 2017, which also includes some leadership competencies. So it's really designed for people who want to be leaders or looking to be leaders in the future. And I'll just have a look, let you have a look at those components whilst I just take a sip of my tea. So as you can see, there are 2 personal elements, self-awareness and self-management, and then there are 2 social elements, so social awareness and relationship management. And I'm going to go through each of these to give you a bit of an understanding of what they are, and then we'll do some exercises. So I'm not going to be able to go through these in any detail just because of the time constraints, but hopefully it's enough to help you understand what each of these 4 sections include. So self-awareness means having a deep understanding of your emotions, your strengths, your weaknesses, your needs and your drives. And so it's about being balanced, being a balanced human being, being a balanced leader, somebody who can manage reality. So if you think about going for interviews, which is something lots of our students do regularly, but all of you will have done sometime in your life. When you come out of the interview, it's likely that you'll immediately focus on the negative elements. So you'll think about what you could have done better, what you forgot to talk about. But people with emotional intelligence, so good self-awareness, are able to think, but actually, I also did this bit quite well, and they seem to like it when I talked about this, so I must remember that in my next interview. And so we'll really try to provide a sort of balanced view of themselves so that when they go forward to their next interview, they know what areas they need to work on and the areas that they possibly struggled with. But it's also being understanding how others see you. And it isn't just about how others see you, but then using that information to act on. So sometimes leaders say, oh, quite indulgently, my team think I'm really a bit of a softie. Well, it's nice to be approachable and people to want to talk to you, but softie also has elements which suggest that you're easy to win over. You're somebody who's not able to deal with conflict management. And so what that probably means is that some of your team feel quite frustrated because those who shout loudest always get their way and everybody else has to deal with the consequences of that. So it's about really thinking, okay, when people say these things, what do they mean? What are the potential undertones? And what can I do about it? You know, what can I take as really good praise and things I need to remember versus what do I also need to think about going forward? The second element is self-management, and in particular, this emotional self-control, which is sometimes known as self-regulation or managing your emotions. Of course, through life, through work, we always have uncomfortable feelings or periods of uncertainty. And we've certainly been going through a large period of uncertainty over the past year. But it's really about how you deal with those emotions. Are you able to deal with those emotions, push them away, carry on trying to be effective, or do they start to take over and bubble up into how you behave, so how you deal with different people, how you react to situations? So one classic example, I'm a big football fan and regularly go to matches. Some people who can't self-regulate will be shouting at players, shouting abuse at the referee, which really isn't acceptable, obviously. And so this is quite an extreme situation, but actually we see it every day on social media. And social media has become a large area where people feel that they don't have to self-regulate their emotions or manage their emotions. And last year we had an instance where Rishi Sunak was photographed with some Yorkshire tea bags, and Twitter went crazy. Not crazy in a positive way, but crazy in terms of abuse. And it took somebody at the end of the Twitter feed for Yorkshire Tea, who had some emotional intelligence, to point out that actually I'm representing the brand, so it isn't as personal as it could be. There's a team supporting me, but actually remember, whenever you vent anger online, you're actually doing that to an individual at the end, and so please try to be kind. And I think sometimes social media feels remote, so people forget that actually somebody else is going to view their comments. And if perhaps we all stopped and thought about posting before we did it and managed those emotions, that would make social media a better place for all. But it isn't just that. In terms of leaders, what do you want? Do you want a leader who, when a crisis is happening, is able to step back, push their emotions aside, and think about the best course forward? Or do you want somebody who's going to become all emotional and upset? I think most of us would really want somebody who can take that step back and put their emotions to a side for a moment. And if we think about Donald Trump, there's an awful lot talked about Donald Trump. I think Trump actually created more drama and anxiety and problems because he had an inability to self-regulate. So when he heard bad news, he would immediately go onto Twitter, or when he was in press conferences, he found it really hard to stop, pause, and think of a suitable response rather than letting his emotions take over. Okay. I'm not going to talk about achievement orientation now because I'm afraid we're going to run out of time, but might talk about that during questions, because I think it's probably an area you might not have expected to see when thinking about emotional intelligence. But if we think now about empathy, or the ability to identify and understand another state and appreciate their position rather than trying to change somebody's mind. Again, on social media, we seem to have little tolerance for different viewpoints. And if somebody has a different opinion to you, it's often seen as wrong. And I'm not talking extreme views which are against diversity or anything, but just simply say having a preference in a cup of tea. So empathy is really important in the workplace, as you know, and especially important for leaders, and especially important to hear those different perspectives. If our leaders only rely on one set of perspectives, then actually that does a disservice to them and everybody else, because there might be a different perspective which is just as valid and perhaps puts a different twist on something that they themselves hadn't thought of. So it's always quite important to have a listen to. But also think to yourself, how well do you read people's expressions? So are you able to tell what is going on in somebody's mind from their expression? Are you able to read people's minds? And facial expressions have been researched a lot, and actually for a long time some research by Paul Ekman which said that facial expressions are universal was the way that we looked at that. We now know that it's slightly more nuanced than we thought, and globally we don't have exactly the same expressions for each emotion, although there are a lot of similarities. I really like this quote from the Big Bang Theory. For those of you who watch it, you'll know that Sheldon has a huge IQ. But actually he learns over time, he learns to respect Penny, who is somebody who has a great deal of social and emotional intelligence. And so he says, but you possess an intelligence I envy. I would choose the ability to read people's minds. And that ability to really be able to go beyond what people are saying and read their emotions is really important for leaders, because we don't always say what we're thinking, and to be able to understand that and understand if somebody's just trying to say something to be positive but is struggling underneath is really important. The second thing I want you to think about is, when is the last time you had a conversation when you truly listened? So you didn't think about what your response was going to be to the other person, what they were saying, but you actually stopped and you paused and you just thought about them and what they were trying to say to you. It's a real skill. I don't manage it all the time. I'm too often thinking about how I can respond. But actually, sometimes just listening to what people are trying to say without the intention of replying is really powerful. And certainly when I think of some of the people who have managed me in the past, the two most effective leaders, the leaders I really admire, were both people who always made you feel like the most important person in the room. They would always really listen to what you said, talk about your perceptions, and really link it into that inspiring leadership. And so you can see how those leaders who are seen as having that skill, those listening skills, can themselves be quite powerful in actually what is quite a quiet form of leadership. But actually, we're now using artificial intelligence to read people's emotions, and we have to be really careful to ensure that this information is correct and there's no inadvertent bias. So all organisations, if they use this technology for looking at video interviews, for example, they really need to consider, are they actually correctly, is the package they're using correctly identifying behaviour, or are they inadvertently discriminating against other groups, which of course would be something that you wouldn't want to do. Another unexpected area of social awareness is organisational awareness, and the ability to understand what's going on in your organisation. And I think this is really important for two aspects. Firstly, in terms of being able to understand if people in your department or others are going through a really challenging time period, they're really busy, so end of year, for example, and is it the right time to approach them? If you have to approach them, trying to use empathy to say, I'm really sorry to contact you now because I know this is your peak time period. However, this is information that can't wait. So actually showing that empathy. But I also think individuals need to use this information for horizon scanning for their own future careers. You need to know if the job you're currently in, what is going to happen to it in the future? Are some parts of it going to be given to artificial intelligence? Is it going to change over time? Is it going to change in such a way which is going to suit your skills? Or do you need to develop new skills? Or perhaps do you need to look at another organisation? Thinking about what's going to happen in organisations in the future. So what sectors are going to be really important in the next 10 years? What sectors are perhaps going to be struggle could make a real difference to what industries you go into. And then finally, the final component is relationship management, which is really a combination of the other three elements. So building and maintaining positive and effective relationships. And we're going to do a little exercise in a bit regarding relationship management and also influence. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come out of the slides. What I'm going to do is get you to take out your phones, if you wouldn't mind, for a moment. We're going to go to a teaching platform called Menti. So if you could take out your phones, if you could go to the address menti.com and put in the code 460486661. Because actually what I'd like you to do is think about how you would rate yourself in the 4 elements that I've just talked about. Now, this is all anonymous, so nobody is going to see your results, so don't worry about that. But I'd like you to rate yourself out of 5, with 5 being very strong, 1 being very weak. Try, if you can, to not put too many on 3, so don't sit on the fence too much. And then remember your scores. And what we try and do is we see everybody else's scores, and then you can actually see how you compare to everybody else in terms of your emotional intelligence. Okay, good. Things are starting to come in, but I know we've got about 70 people here, so we're wait a little bit. Now, obviously, this is quite a crude self-assessment measure. It's just something quite simple, and so obviously has some limitations. Can anybody tell me what might be a sort of a downside to using a self-assessment when looking at emotional intelligence? Maybe just put it into the chat, if that's okay, whilst we wait for a few more people. Okay. That's exactly it, Lyle. Brilliant, thank you. So we might not always be aware of our strengths and weaknesses. And so the irony is, if you're somebody with limited self-awareness, how can you really judge your self-awareness on a self-assessment form? So yes, it is quite ironic in many ways. Yes, so you've got blind spots in your own perception. And actually what you'd be better off doing is a 360 evaluation, so getting your manager's feedback, your peer group, and those people you're managing as well. this is really interesting to see. So a lot of similarities, but it's interesting that self-management has come out a little lower than the other categories. And I'm just wondering why that is. So is it that self-regulation element, or is it something else? What I'm going to do is just print screen on that, so just in case we need to come back to that later. But I'll go back to the slides, and then we might come back to that later if anybody's got any questions. Okay, let me go back into the slides. So that's the emotion. Okay, so let's do a couple more exercises. But firstly, I love this quote by Locke about introspection, or what is essentially reflection. And how important it is, because really we should all be monitoring our degree of focus, so areas we tend to focus on, but also our defensive reactions and what triggers emotional responses in us. And so all of us should, when we feel uncomfortable emotions, try to think to ourselves, why has that happened? What has set me off? And what perhaps can I do about that in the future? And one way you can sort of look at how you manage your emotional intelligence is by completing something like this type of radar. Now, for those of you who are business studies students or have completed the BU MBA, you will have come across radars from Rebecca Hindley and Milena Bothover. But if you haven't come across them before, all you do is you choose some areas to assess yourself. So what I try to do is pick emotional intelligence areas which particularly relate to leadership. And then you would rate yourself on all of them as a starting point. And then what you would do is you would provide yourself some exercises and gradually see how you improve. And so you might start off with the green line, which shows your original starting point, red line 3 months later, grey line 6 months later, because I think there's something quite powerful about being able to see self-improvement. Stephen Covey, who wrote the 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, really talks about how the single most powerful investment we can ever make in our life is the investment in ourselves. And I'm a great believer in that. I think that we really should be investing in ourselves every day of our lives. And that's difficult, I know, because we're all busy, but sometimes it's as simple as just watching other people's behaviour. So I'm a real people's person, and I like to watch what my colleagues are doing and really think to myself about what they do, which is fantastic. And I've got so many fantastic comments, that bit's quite easy. But also I like to watch leaders when they do things which perhaps are not successful as well, and think about how that could be improved. And we all have to put our own twist on these things. But I think over time it's very easy to do some small interventions like that to help us improve. And the great thing about emotional intelligence is actually, whilst there is a genetic element, most of it is learnt behaviour. So all of us can develop in this area, and all of us can improve from repeated experience. So in the same way that when you exercise for a long period, your fitness levels improve by practicing emotional intelligent behaviours regularly, you can become a more emotionally intelligent person. So that's always great, because it means that success is just round the corner. I always remember a friend telling me about an old boss of hers who was the manager of the HR department at an organisation she worked at many years ago. It was a bank, and she said that her manager, who was the head of the department, every Friday in his diary had a note saying, "Go round to the department and wish everybody a good weekend." So here was somebody who was self-aware enough to realise that emotional intelligence, he struggled a little bit with the social side, and so was trying to do something positive to change his behaviour. So he would only need to do that, have it written in his diary for about 4 months, and that would become a learnt behaviour, and he would do it without even thinking about it. And so this is the sort of thing that you can do quite easily. I'm afraid just by taking this class today, it won't be enough to set you off and change your behaviour, but hopefully it can give you a few tips on what you can do. I'm actually going to go on to a second exercise, which is looking at relationship management, because I'm conscious of the time moving on. So relationship management is, of course, really important for leaders, and being able to maintain or build and maintain strong relationships is very important. And it's partly about influence, but partly because work is very much an exchange relationship, and you have to have relationships with lots of people to be able to effectively manage that exchange relationship. So what I want you to do is to think about the relationships you have either in the workplace or if you're a student at university. And I want you to consider these relationships in terms of strategic relationships, operational relationships, and personal relationships. And of course, there's going to be a little bit of overlap here, so there will be a bit of blurring of lines. But try to think out what proportion of your relationships are strategic, operational, and personal. And as I've done in this example, try and put a percentage to all of them. So try and make them work out to 100 overall. And actually, this is mine. So what you can see is I've got really strong operational and personal relationships, which is really useful at maintaining relationship. So it means I've got lots of different people I can talk to, get their perspectives about different things, which is so important. Where I'm really lacking is strategic relationships. A couple of years ago, that was about 5%, so I'm improving. And I worked out the reason is because in the past, I've always thought of that sort of political behaviour that you need in strategic relationships. I've always looked at that as a negative thing. And actually, it was only a couple of years ago I realised I was looking at it from the wrong perspective. And actually, as a leader, for you to be effective and a benefit to your teams, be it a team, department, group, or a company, you have to have these strategic relationships so that if you need to get extra staff, you've got people who you can influence, who are on your side. If you need to build a budget, build up your budget, you've got people who can help you there. So that was probably really obvious to most people. It wasn't incredibly obvious to me. Sorry, what I should have said, if you're a student, it's slightly more difficult to work out these. So if you were looking at operational relationships, I would say that's the people you work with in group work, maybe people who you meet in societies or sports teams who you know but aren't your friends. And then strategic relationship would be perhaps with your unit tutor, your program leader, people on who teach on STEEP, Global Talent Program, those sort of people. Sorry, I should have said that before. Now, going back to what I was talking about, these strategic relationships, those of you who have got a high figure in that area don't now think, yeah, I've cracked it. I've got this relationship management sorted. Because actually, if you're too high in this area, there is perhaps a negative element to this, because perhaps you've built these relationships for more political means or influence means, and actually haven't then gone on to deepen the relationship, and so that you haven't got as many personal relationships. And the potential problem is that people know that you've tried to form a relationship with them on a purely strategic basis, and so actually not for the right reasons. And so when you try to influence or you want something from them, they're actually less likely to help than if you've got other strong relationships, because they don't necessarily feel that they have produced or have a really strong relationship with you. So it's worth just thinking about that a little bit. Now, I wanted to tell you about some of the criticisms, which I'm not going to do because we haven't got time, other than this last point, because there is some research that suggests that if you try to game emotional intelligence, so pretend to have empathy, pretend to have social intelligence, that actually people can see through that, and then your team will consider you to be quite inauthentic, because actually they can see you're not doing it for the right reasons. And so emotional intelligence is not something you can really game. It's something that if you want to do it, you've really got to try and invest in it to bring the many benefits. So to just finish off before we go on to the Q&A, what sort of things can you do to develop emotional intelligence? Well, there's lots of self-assessments that you can undertake. You might want to do something you like a Johari window, but if you're a student at Bournemouth University or a staff member, you can actually go and do a number of self-assessments on My Career Hub. They're actually called career assessments, but actually a lot of them fit with emotional intelligence. So things like emotional control, which we've been talking about. So I definitely recommend doing those. Think about goal setting. So not just goal setting for emotional intelligence, but goal setting for just for your own motivation. And do ensure you use SMART goals so you've got more chance of actually being successful and achieving them. In terms of empathy, I read about this one the other day. So as tutors, we've got used to teaching with people's screens turned off. Sometimes there's a very good reason, like today, where we're doing it for bandwidth. But actually, sometimes when you're in a small group or you're in a work situation, such as a department meeting, turn on your screen, because firstly, it means that the person talking or leading the session is able to read your emotions and so gets a sense of people understanding what you're talking about. And so that will help them in terms of running the session, and so they feel very grateful for you in actually being a person at the end of the screen. But also, because if you've got your camera switched on, you have to pay more attention. And so it's less easy to go off and look at your emails and things. So actually will help to develop your empathy skills as well. other things you can do is, of course, after that relationship management exercise, think about the areas where you need to build connections. So start to be a little bit more strategic in building relationships, although still make sure you're doing them for the right reasons. And maybe find a mentor. I like to have lots of different mentors for different areas. I don't always call it a mentor relationship, but there's definitely people I go to regularly who I really value their opinion and like to get their perception on different things. Okay, so sorry that we've had to rush through that session. What I want to do now is for you to go back to Mentimeter and to put onto Menti, what is the one thing that you're going to do to improve your emotional intelligence? So I'm just going to, in fact, I'll come out of my screen. I'll stop sharing that and go back to the Mentimeter. And apologies if you've put that away now. I'm trying to actually go on to the next question. But what I'm going to do is, after you've put your comments online, what I should do is post these in a month's time onto LinkedIn, and so you can see the progress you've made. Now, again, this will all be anonymous, so you don't have to worry about what other people would think. But I'd like to you to think about one thing that you'd like to change to actually, or do to develop your emotional intelligence. Excellent. So we've got some thoughts coming through already. So ask for more feedback. Excellent. That's really good. And ask for different people's feedback. Oh, I think there's been some internet issues, so apologies for those of you who can't hear or see. But I'm glad to see all of the people who are managing to hear. That's really fantastic. So we've got things about listening, thinking about your self-awareness. Reaching out to a mentor, excellent. Thinking about the conversations you have, reviewing LinkedIn, that's a really good point. LinkedIn is so useful these days, and I would recommend everybody to use it. I must admit, I haven't done so as much this year since we've been in lockdown because it's been so busy. Yeah, definitely use that a lot. So assessing your own strengths and weaknesses, being more self-aware, being self-reflective, excellent, and open to criticism, excellent, because that's a really hard thing for all of us to do. But I think if you take it from a perspective of, I want to improve my self-awareness and my understanding of myself, then you take off the critical element and it actually feels like something that you are doing for the right reasons. Brilliant. So what I'm going to do is stop sharing now, because I'm conscious that people may have some questions. And what I'm also going to do is, I have a number of links that I think you might find useful. So I'm going to put them into the chat so that you can copy and paste them. So there's one there about increasing your influence. Everybody can get access to 2 Harvard Business Review articles a month. So even if you're not in education where you can get lots of access to articles, you can get 2 a month. There's some exercises around empathy, which I think are really helpful. And this talk by Simon Sinek on empathy, I think is absolutely amazing, and I'd recommend everybody watches that one. I mentioned testing your emotional intelligence via facial expressions. So Barclay have a test that everybody should be able to do there, so you can see how good you are at that. And then finally, there's a link to influencing schools for students, although I think some of it's useful for everybody. Okay, I'm going to go into the chat now and see some of your questions.